Yeah, my research was on trait expectancies and how they bias how we perceive and how we see other people. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of introduction and background, go on to my methods, talk about the results I got, and then kind of give a broader overarching discussion. So start off with introduction. Undoubtedly, the physical appearance of another person affects how we judge their personality and how we judge their traits. So we know that we automatically characterize others by sex, race, and age. We infer attractiveness, competence, trustworthiness, friendliness just from looking at somebody. And even if the accuracy of these judgments varies, so even if I look at somebody and I think they're trustworthy and they're actually not, there's still high agreement among perceivers. So most of us in this room would agree that they look trustworthy, even if they're not. Moving into more recent research by Ostrov and Fedorov, there was a large study conducted to see on what dimensions do we actually evaluate other faces. To see what dimensions do we actually evaluate other faces on. What are the principal dimensions that we judge another face on? And they conducted a principal components analysis of a significant amount of judgments of emotionally ambiguous faces and found that, in fact, there's two main dimensions that account for the majority of the variance of faces we perceive. And those are dominance and valence, or trustworthiness. But, of course, face evaluation isn't just a bottom-up process. We don't just evaluate a person in their face by what we see. It's also a top-down process as well, with higher-level knowledge in the form of expectancies and motivations and stereotypes, among other knowledge structures playing a role. In a recent model by Professor Freeman in 2010, this model of the person construct, in which higher-level input coordinates with stereotypes, coordinates with category levels, so sex, race, and age, and with facial, body, and voice cues to create, I think there's somebody else trying to get in, to create this overall construct of how we perceive another person. So what are some of these top-down influences on perception? So prior literature has shown that individuals high in prejudice are more likely to perceive ambiguous faces as black when faces displayed anger than when they display happiness. So the stereotype of black is angry caused these people who are high in prejudice, so they hold the stereotype, to perceive the faces as black. Another example was if you see a target who has an emotionally ambiguous expression and you know what genre of television they're watching, it helps you to aid the resolution of that expression. So clearly there are top-down influences on the evaluation of other people and on our evaluation of their faces and their facial expressions. Moving sideways a little bit to talk about trait expectancies. These expectancies are what we expect from another's actions and personality. So they're what we expect from somebody from our experience with them, from our beliefs, from our observations, and from categorical cues like their sex, their race, and their age again. And again, there's a literature on these trait expectancies, and the significant literature is how they can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies. So they bias our perception of other behavior and affect our interaction with them. And the classic example that I bet a lot of you have heard of is the effects of teacher expectations on performance. So a teacher believes a student is lazy or they have some other negative characteristic. They differentiate the behavior towards that student, they give them less attention, the student actually underperforms, and it meets the original assumption by the teacher. So the prophecy fulfilled itself. Again, there's a rich literature on the effects of these trait expectancies on our interactions, on our memory of events with people, on the integration of new information about them, and our behavior towards them, again with this teacher-student example. So to recap, we know there's both bottom-up and top-down influences on perception. We know that group-level stereotypes can influence perception. And we know that trait expectancies can bias our perception of others' behavior and affect our interactions with them and lead to these self-fulfilling prophecies. But what is still currently unknown is whether such trait expectancies can have effects on lower levels of processing. So can these trait expectancies alter the basic way we mentally represent a face? And that's the question I was trying to answer with the study. Do trait expectancies exert such a top-down influence on how a face is actually low-level visually represented? This has clear implications for everyday interactions. And additionally, I wanted to see how the strength of a relationship with a person could moderate this effect. So there's a lot of research saying that as we get to know somebody more and more, our personality judgments of them become more and more accurate. This makes sense. We get more experience with them. But is this a moderating factor on such a trait expectancy bias effect? So on to the methods. The main method I used was this somewhat recent technique called reverse correlation. And it's this very data-driven bottom-up method to determine what a participant's mental representation of another space is. And it doesn't rely on participant self-report. So in the past, there were studies that tried to, you could have a participant draw a face, you could have a participant select features that looked like a person's face, but this reverse correlation method allows us to avoid this participant self-report bias and really get at what the mental representation of this person is. So how does it work? So you take a base face, and then you generate a random noise pattern like this one. So then you create a trial, and one of these trials is the base face with the random noise pattern added, and the other trial is the base face with the random noise pattern subtracted. So we have one base face and one random noise pattern, and with it we've generated one trial. So I would ask the participant which image looks more like J, and say the left one here. And if we do this hundreds of times and then average the noise, these random noise patterns that they have consistently chosen to look more like me, we can generate this classification image and this mental representation of what people think or what these participants think looks like me, what their actual representation is, without having them draw it out. So research has shown that this technique is sensitive enough to display trait information along multiple dimensions. So this is a base face, and from this base face, research has showed that they could generate trustworthiness and dominance and submissiveness and untrustworthiness. This method has also been used to demonstrate that stereotypes can shift the perception of an actor. So in the Netherlands, there are a lot of prejudices against Moroccans. So they blocked groups of participants into high prejudice, moderate prejudice, and low prejudice, and used reverse correlation to get at what these people's mental representations of Moroccans were. And they found that people with high prejudice generated faces that were judged as being more criminal looking than those low in prejudice. So some other studies have shown that political leaning shift perception and relationship status shifts perception. So clearly this reverse correlation method is very powerful, and that's why I chose to use it for this study. So again, the question is, how do our experiences with and impressions of familiar others around us, such as in the form of these trait expectancies, shape our mental representation of their faces? So to address this, I designed a similar reverse correlation task to the ones I've shown you. And my general study kind of had two phases. So the first phase was the image construction phase. So I brought in 4 targets to the lab, and I took photos of their faces, and I made them black and white. And then I had them recruit friends and teammates and classmates and peers and floor mates and really anybody they could get to come to the lab who at least knew them in some way. And each one of these participants looked at 200 or 300 of those trials, so 200 or 300 of those face pairs. And I was able to generate a classification image or a mental representation for their peer targets. So here are just 2 of the example classification images I got. And you can see there's definite variance, especially around the chin in these 2, of how people represented this target. And then, once they were done with the trials, I didn't show them the mental representation, but I did have them rate the target on 6 traits, on likability, trustworthiness, dominance, confidence, and attractiveness. And then I also had them complete some questionnaires on their need to belong, their loneliness, and then their perceived relationship strength with the person, and then I also had them answer some demographic questions. So once the image construction was completed, I had 41 of these mental representation classification image faces, and then I also had the original 4 base faces. These were the actual true-to-life photos of the participants. And I put them on Amazon's Mechanical Turk to get an independent sample of how people that didn't know these people would judge these photos of their faces. So I had independent raters judge them on the same trait dimensions. And then I averaged the ratings to get an independent judgment of both these base faces and the classification images. So again, what I was looking for is the bias in these classification images. So how people's expectancies with and experiences with the target affected their representation versus the true-to-life photo. And I had the ratings of the base faces and then the classification images by this same independent rating pool. So what I did was I subtracted the trait judgments of the base faces from the classification images. So if this is a classification image from one participant, and this is the real photo of that target, then I take the rating of this face for trustworthiness, and I subtract the rating of the real face for trustworthiness. And what I get is a measure of bias for trustworthiness for that mental representation. And then back to the Ozerov and Todorov research with the 2 dimensions of dominance and valence, or dominance and trustworthiness. I averaged likability and trustworthiness and warmth to produce this overall valence bias scores of the classification images and the base faces. And then I correlated this overall valence bias score with the participant valence judgment of the targets. So people who came into the lab, how they judge the target's valence, and how independent raters judge the valence bias in the targets. I also wanted to see, again, if strength of relationship moderated perceptual bias, so I conducted a multiple regression where I regressed bias different scores onto strength of relationship and the participant ratings. So I'm going to kind of split my results in half and give a little brief discussion of each one of those. So onto the kind of main study, onto the main effect that I was looking for. I did find that generated classification image, so mental representation, was significantly biased by participants' assessments of the target's personality. So participant trait expectancies of the target valence were significantly related. They did significantly correlate with the valence, with the bias judged in these classification images from the different score I just showed you. I didn't find a significant correlation between competence or dominance judgments, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think that is later. And I also found no moderating effect of relationship imbalance by either of the scales I used as well. So to discuss this a little bit, participants' trait expectancies do seem to manifest themselves in mental representations, and specifically the judgments of the dimension of valence seem to manifest in the valence evaluations of these spaces. And again, no significant effect of relationship strength on this degree of bias was found. So what are the implications of this? Why is it that no relationship of classification image bias in participant judgments were found for competence and dominance? So if you recall, these dimensions are orthogonal. So the vast majority of the variance in how we judge each other's faces is on this dimension of warmth. Of valence. It's on trustworthiness, it's on warmth, it's on likability. And those will all get lumped together. So it's possible that since dominance and competence are judged on this orthogonal dimension, that those traits simply aren't biased in an image. It's also possible that these traits weren't as legible for the target subject for some reason, so participants just didn't affect they didn't bias their representations as much for whatever reason. In general, I don't really think I can necessarily draw a conclusion here, so I would really want a more focused study to explain this lack of bias. To the second part of my results, however, I did conduct the regression, and although I found no overall moderating effect of friendship strength on bias, I did find that participants who had a strong relationship with the target and rated them high in dominance represented them also as more trustworthy. And this effect didn't occur for participants who had a low relationship strength with the target. So if they reported they were really good friends with somebody, the more they called them dominant, the more their mental representation looked trustworthy. But the same effect wasn't true for people who reported less for relationship strength. And additionally, I wanted to point something out in the correlation matrices just among the independent ratings and among the participant ratings. So if I look at how these strangers on Mechanical Turk, these strangers on the internet, rated dominance, I can see that dominance is significantly negatively correlated with all of these, with likability, with trustworthiness, with warmth, with confidence, and with attractiveness. But then if I look at participants who came to the lab, who were mostly friends of the targets, I can see that the only thing dominance is significantly correlated with is confidence. I don't see the same significant negative correlations. So it seems as though peers viewed the dominance of targets they knew as a positive quality, while independent raters, these strangers on Mechanical Turk, demonstrated the opposite effect. And again, the stronger the reported friendship, the more an increase in participant dominance rating resulted in positive trustworthiness bias for the generated faces. So what are the implications of this? It seems in line with established theory of kind of intergroup relations research. And again, the finding was supported by comparing these correlation matrices. So if somebody is in my in-group and they are perceived as dominant, that's an asset to my group. So I would view that as something that would correlate with positive valence. It's an asset for my group, but if they're in an out-group, if they're my enemy, for example, their dominance is a threat and thus wouldn't be correlated with positive valence. And again, the correlation matrices back this up. Participant valence ratings didn't correlate with dominance, but independence valence ratings negatively correlated with dominance ratings, such that strangers saw dominance as less of a positive quality. So on to a more general discussion. This study has provided evidence that we do not recall the faces of those in our lives exactly as they appear. And instead, it seems as though we bias our mental representations of how we see them, even if we may interact with them in person every day. To move into some limitations, one inherent constraint lied in how I recruited my participants. So I had my targets and I brought them into the lab, and then I asked them to recruit 10 or 11 participants to come in each. So if any of you got an email from somebody and you really, really didn't like that person, even if you were getting paid by the experiment to come in, you're not going to come in complete Jay's study for his senior thesis. So I definitely got a selection bias where I had the majority of people who held positive feelings towards the participants. So I definitely had this selection bias and a limited range issue, which I think only could have dampened the sensitivity to effects. So what I would want to do in a future study would figure out a way to recruit participants who maybe held more neutral or negative feelings about my targets. So to wrap up there's clearly a strong role of top-down factors in basic social perception, and the presented findings kind of contribute to the strong literature. Additionally, previous research mostly is focused on novel faces, but here the perception of familiar faces has been demonstrated to be biased as well. So when you're coming into the lab, you're not just seeing the faces of these random novel strangers, you're seeing the faces of those who are familiar to you, and we've demonstrated that they're biased as well here. Additionally, on the trait expectancies, their impacts may be more pervasive than previously assumed. So we've shown in prior literature that these trait expectancies can affect our memory for events, they affect our social behavior with people, they affect our impressions of them. But this has shown that these trait expectancies can have a much earlier and much more low-level effect on how we actually perceive the person and how we actually see their face. So there's some exciting future directions here, in my opinion. One thing in the first priority would be to work to establish some sort of causation effect. So I've shown a relationship between this positive valence bias and participants' positive valence judgments. But what I would want to do would be in-lab manipulations to establish these trait expectancies in a controlled setting and then see if they still affect these mental representations. And I would also want to explore the plasticity of these effects. So if there was recent experience that clashed with these prior expectations, how would this impact our mental representations, for example? So to conclude, the studies provided evidence that our trait expectancies of others seem to shape our mental representations of their faces. And as kind of a last point to leave you with, this really points to another powerful self-fulfilling prophecy of these trait expectancies. So if these trait expectancies do shape our basic visual perception of people, does this perception then drive a strengthening of these expectancies? And I think clearly future research is needed to pursue this further. So thank you all for listening.